Now, let's have a look at the SSO and the basic principles of Kerberos.
Firstly, let's have a short review of SSO, which is the abbreviation of single sign-on. We say that SSO is a part of identity management of the big data platform, and with SSO, the user only needs to log into one component with credentials, and then switch freely between components on the platform, which significantly improves the user experience, right? And this can be achieved because multiple application systems share a same set of login credentials. Generally speaking, SSO can be implemented via the following approaches. Firstly, cookies-based approach. After a user logs in, the user's identity authentication information is stored in cookies. When a user accesses a protected resource provided by the application server obtains information from cookies to verify whether the user has been authenticated. Secondly, broker-based approach. In this approach, an authentication server is used to authenticate and manage user account information in a unified manner, and a digital identity is given to a user for accessing the application server. Thirdly, agent-based approach. In this approach, there is an authentication agent located on the application server. The agent acts as a translator between the authentication system of the application server and the authentication protocol adopted by the client. Fourthly, agent and broker-based approach. This approach is based on the agent and broker. You can simply regard this approach as using broker as a particular agent in the application system. Fifthly, gateway-based approach. This approach records the identity information of the client user to avoid rereading and authorization requests. Finally, token-based approach. This approach involves a user ID and a number generator, which is similar to the secret key. And specifically, on Huawei Big Data platform, Kerberos is used as a trusted third-party broker-based authentication service. It is a traditional password-based authentication service to implement SSO. So what is Kerberos? It is named after the voracious three-headed guard dog of Hades from Greek mythology, and is used for identity authentication. We can use data encryption standard or even advanced encryption standard for data management. In Huawei Big Data platform, we use KRB server to provide Kerberos functions for all components. Notice that it provides services for all components in an MRS cluster. And there are three core elements of KRB server. The Kerberos client, which is a bridge between users and the Kerberos cluster. Kerberos KDC server, which provides services for KDC, of course. And the key component, key distribution center, which is responsible for producing tickets and session keys. KDC is composed of two parts, an authentication server and a ticket granting server. With the help of all the three components, Kerberos provides identity authentication in a similar way as the passing rules of the amusement park. Here, we can introduce the full process by some vivid cartoons. Firstly, do you still remember the two parts of KDC of the KRB server? The AS and TGS, right? So, the AS is like the gatekeeper. The first thing we need to do is to pass the authentication to the AS, and then a ticket called ticket granting ticket, or TGT for short, will be created and granted to the visitor by the AS. Then, the visitor can use the TGT to enter the park. However, it is not enough for entering a service like the Sky Wheel, because the administrator requires a service ticket, or ST in short. Therefore, the visitor needs to update the ST by swapping the TGT on the TGS here. The visitor can obtain the ST if he or she has been granted the access permission. If not, the ST cannot be obtained. Only after obtaining the ST could the visitor enter the Sky Wheel. For other programs, repeat the previous operations or use SSO instead for convenience. So from the vivid process we mentioned before, maybe you could not remember all the responsibilities of all the roles in Kerberos. But don't worry, you can refer to this table for necessity. I believe this table should be helpful to all of you. In general, the full process can be concluded as follows. Step 1, a client requires a client to TGS ticket and session key from the Kerberos AS. The client sends an authentication request to the AS. The request message includes a unique identifier and a TGS identifier. The client obtains a client to TGS ticket and session key. Step 2, the AS checks if the unique identifier of the user is stored in the database. and if found, generates a client to TGS session key and encrypts it with the client AS session key. The AS then generates a TGT used by the user to access the TGS, encrypts the TGT with the TGS key and returns the message to the client. Step 3. After receiving the message returned by AS, the Kerberos client decrypts the client or TGS session key and sends to the TGS an authenticator message containing the Kerberos service to be accessed and encrypted with the client or TGS session key. Step 4. The TGS decrypts the received message and verifies the ID of the user based on the timestamp obtained through decryption. If the TGS verifies that the Kerberos client is authorized to access the Kerberos service requested, it sends a client server session key and an ST to the client. The request message is encrypted with client TGS session key. Step 5. The Kerberos client decrypts the message sent by the TGS to retrieve the client server session key and submits the ST and the authenticator message of the client to the Kerberos service. Step 6. The Kerberos service compares the message in the ST with the authenticator message sent by the client. If the two messages are basically the same, the Kerberos service can provide the requested services for the client. The Kerberos client decrypts the received confirmation message to obtain the timestamp and verifies whether the timestamp is valid. The mutual authentication is now completed.
Alright, that's all for this section. Hope you enjoy it. Next, we will come to the final section in this chapter, which is about the scenario architecture of this system in Huawei Cloud.